All right, it's about time to get started this evening. Good evening, everybody. We are in Genesis 37 tonight. We started the story of Joseph, that is the generations of Jacob, on Sunday. And on Sunday we talked about the visions that Joseph purports to have had. And we took note of just the way that Moses presents Joseph as rather full of himself. That he is constantly trying to draw attention to what he's saying. Whenever he has a second dream, he is really ham-fisted about it. The interpretations of his dreams are pretty obvious. He tells the first dream, and his brothers just right out of the gate know what it means, or what he means for it to mean. He tells the second dream, excuse me, and Moses tells us that he kept telling it. And again, Jacob is able to discern pretty much immediately the meaning of it. We had a question left over from Sunday that I wasn't sure about and have done a little research on. So this happens after we've already been told about the death of Rachel. All right, but we know that things do happen. Things are recorded in the biblical histories, sometimes out of order. Right? The ancients didn't think of history in the way that we think of history. Like we think you start at the beginning and you have to be, completely, you're essentially journalistic about it in your telling of it. You try to, remove any sort of bias, and you tell things straight through in chronological order. Pretty much none of that is true of biblical history or any ancient history. But, do the biblical histories have a bias to them? Well, yeah, they oughta. It's God's bias. God's way of understanding history is the proper way of understanding history. And so he's going to include these lessons in there. And also, it's not uncommon to find things out of order. So there's this question of, did these visions happen while Rachel was still alive? Because Jacob says, excuse me, in verse 10. All right, but when he told it, that is when he kept telling it, to his father and to his brothers, his father, Jacob, rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" All right, so Jacob refers to Joseph's mother, who obviously is Rachel. So does this happen while Rachel is still alive or not? So the short answer is that this is probably happening after Rachel has passed, because, all right, what all does Joseph see bowing down to him into the vision? What all bows down to Joseph in this vision that he tells to Jacob? All right, the sun, the moon, and how many stars? The 11 stars. Meaning, well, who do the stars represent? His brothers, the sons of Jacob, his 11 brothers bowing down to him, all right, meaning that Benjamin has been born, meaning Rachel's dead. So what's this business of, shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Sorry? Uh-huh. All right, so, like I said it in a footnote, or what? Okay. Well, and that's the thing. They're meant to represent his parents, but what do we mean by, and what does Jacob mean by your mother?
Probably refers to Leah.
Because Leah is matriarch of the family. All right, consider this. Who's Jesus' dad? I mean, it's... and that's the thing. Like we all understand whenever we're reading the Gospels, and the Gospels understand this too, right? That Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus, right? That he's born miraculously without a biological father. In fact, even Luke, in his genealogy at the end of Luke 3, says, that he was the son of Joseph as it was supposed. Right? But then Luke just goes right ahead and he traces the genealogy of Jesus from Joseph. And Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph. We don't get genealogies through Mary. Biblically, Joseph is considered to be the father in particularly in the legal sense, right? That Joseph, well, we could also put it this way. Growing up, did Jesus have to obey the authority of Joseph? Absolutely. In fact, Luke tells us that he did. That whenever he went home after the finding in the temple at the end of Luke chapter 2, he was submissive not just to Mary, his biological mother, he was submissive to them, to Joseph as well. So just because Joseph is not biological father doesn't really mean anything.
Also, the brothers weren't also his full.
And they also weren't full brothers. So we, sometimes in our family relations, we want to get hyper precise about things in biological terms. And we want to include all kinds of qualifiers to things. Oh, that's a stepmother, not actually a mother. Or that's a half brother and not a full brother. And compared to us, the ancients were kind of loosey-goosey about that. So in other words, it's not outside the norm for Jacob to refer to someone refer to Leah as Joseph's mother, even though Leah is not the biological mother. Yeah, that makes sense. And again, the 11 stars being there, Joseph's not bowing down to himself, right? Those are 11 sons.
I was going to say, by way of argument, she had the mother and the father.
Absolutely, yeah.
So then that would fit in that sense of the word.
Yeah, and as we will see, by the end of all of this, Leah is absolutely the matriarch of the family. Rachel, as we've noted, is buried by the side of the road. Leah is going to hold a different position.
Just to let you know, we were talking about this a while ago, how that might be translation is the role for denomination.
Right.
And that's another one of the places.
Yeah, well, and that's not uncommon for translators to engage in some interpreting. Sometimes it can't be helped. I think in this case it could be. And sometimes whenever your translator is doing interpretation for you, your translator's wrong. Let's see. Okay, so that question being answered, we're ready to move on to chapter 37, starting in verse 12, where we see this trouble between Joseph and his brothers escalate. We've gotten an introduction to their relationship, and it should seem kind of familiar to us, shouldn't it? Because we saw that there was some strife between Ishmael and Isaac, and we saw that there was strife between Jacob and Esau. And so it makes complete sense that as Moses is going through this part of the story, we again see strife between the brothers. So before we jump into our text, let's pray together. Righteous Father, thank you for the great gifts you've given us today. Thank you for your word. Thank you, Father, for your plan that you accomplished through the patriarchs, through the prophets, through the judges, through the kings, through all of your servants through history, Father, coming all the way down to your Son, Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. And Father, we thank you most of all for the work that you have accomplished through him, that through him you have given us the forgiveness of sins, and that through him we have the hope of the resurrection. And Father, we thank you for the continuing work of the church that you started through the apostles and that you've continued down to this day. And that still continues through us. And Father, when we consider the history of your people, we realize that we have some very big shoes to fill. And so, Father, I pray that you equip us and give us strength and give us a will to work for your purposes on earth. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. All right, Genesis 37, verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, and I tell you, before we continue, he said to him, "Here I am." That response that Joseph gives to Jacob. Where are we most familiar with that phrase from? Where does that phrase most famously come from? Yeah, Abraham and Isaac, right? So Abraham says to God, "Here I am," right? And Isaac, when he says likewise to Isaac, whenever Isaac is calling out to him. All right, keep that in mind. So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And again, before we continue, that phrase, "saw from afar." This one's maybe a little more obscure. But do you remember whenever Abraham and Isaac were riding to the mountain, they saw it from afar? Yeah, this is just, I want us to notice as we're going through the text, the sorts of things that Moses does to foreshadow things and put us in mind of particular situations. Moses has now dropped a couple of just little verbal cues that something bad's about to happen to Joseph. There's going to be some conflict going on here. All right, so they saw him from afar. Before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. When Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it?" Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And then they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe." A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Okay.
Some strange, I don't know.
Go for it.
They sold him to the Midianite traders,
Uh-huh.
okay? But then it says, then Reuben returned to the pit, and he wasn't in the pit, he tore his clothes, so that means that Reuben wasn't with them when they sold him.
Right.
But it doesn't say that. But you kind of pick up.
Right. That's implied in the text that he has gone off somewhere for some purpose. Yeah, we're not really sure. And he comes back at some point and sees that Joseph is gone. So, and we're also told, I mean, in the very next chapter, in chapter 38, starts with Judah leaving his brothers. So we get the sense from this episode that the brothers are not all there all the time, that some of them can kind of come and go as they please. Reuben, in particular, being the oldest one, who knows what all he has to do, but he definitely has the authority, the status to kind of come and go as he pleases. He would basically be the supervisor here. All right, so the whole episode starts with the brothers sent off to pasture near Shechem, and Israel sends Joseph out to bring back a report, to go essentially see how they're doing. And of course, as Jacob would want to see how they're doing, perhaps because of where they're camped out at. They're pasturing near Shechem. When was the last time we saw Shechem in Jacob's story? Well, he's worried, we know at the end of chapter 34, that Simeon and Levi have made him a stench in everybody's nostrils. All right, now apparently in the meantime, since the end of chapter 34, people have settled into Shechem. The city has become repopulated. But the sons of Jacob are still going to be infamous around the city of Shechem. Why is there, this city left open, available for settling? Well, because two of these guys came and killed everybody and took, all the men, and took all the women and children captive. That's why. And now they're out pasturing by the city. And so Jacob says, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word," or bring me a report. So Joseph went out, and this first attempt to find the brothers is kind of comical. Again, Moses is not giving us the sense that Joseph is a particularly inspiring figure at this point. Because his first attempt to go find his brothers results in him just wandering around aimlessly in a field. All right, let's see, verse 15. A man found him. Notice how the perspective shifts away from Joseph, away from Israel, to all of a sudden there's just this random guy walking through a field, and he sees Joseph just wandering around, almost like he's checking under rocks. Right? We're just supposed to get the sense that Joseph is basically lost. And so the guy asks, "Well, what are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers." And he's able to tell them where they've gone, to Dothan. Excuse me. So he goes to Dothan, and his brothers see him from afar. Excuse me. Again, cueing us in that something bad is going to be happening here. And that's verified for us almost immediately. They conspired against him to kill him. Now, of course, if we've got the sacrifice of Isaac in mind, we know that this is kind of an ominous situation, but what do we know ultimately happens to Isaac? He is delivered. In fact, we're told he is restored to his father. The Hebrew writer, like we noted back whenever we read Genesis 22, the Hebrew writer says that in a sense, Abraham did receive him back from the dead. Right? The boy is restored to his father. And Isaac is, of course, what's Isaac's status? Well, he is the chosen son. And so from some of these cues, we're told that Joseph is going to be the special one in this story from here out. Now, he's not going to be chosen for the lineage of the Messiah, right? We know which of the sons is chosen for the lineage of the Messiah. It's Judah. Judah's not going to have a central part in this story until chapter 38. And then, towards the end of the book, he still won't have a central role, but he'll have an important role towards the end of the book, particularly around chapter 44. All right, but Moses is cueing us in. Joseph is going to be somebody special. So they say to themselves, in verse 19, here comes this dreamer. Or this is what they say is Lord of Dreams, or Master of Dreams. They're mocking him, condescending him, this guy who's got control of all these dreams. Let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And by the way, it's important to know that in Hebrew, the word for pit is also the same word for prison, because that's where you would imprison people. If you had to keep somebody in a prison, chuck them in a hole in the ground, and that makes for a pretty good prison. Mm-hmm.
The other translation says cistern.
Cistern, yeah, and I think it's in my footnote as well. Yeah, or cisterns. So the idea is that if you find a big shelf of rock, what you can do is you can hew a cistern into it, and it'll collect rainwater. But it's not going to hold rainwater all the time. And whenever it's dried out, it's a very convenient place to put people that you want to, keep put in one spot. And that's what happens to Joseph here. Now, of course, we know ultimately what's going to happen to Joseph. He's going to end up in an Egyptian prison. This is doing some more foreshadowing for us. Here, his brothers have him imprisoned in what's literally just supposed to be a cistern. But later, the Egyptians are going to have him put in an actual purpose-built prison. Okay, so they're going to kill him. But Reuben hears of it and rescues him from their hands. Excuse me. So Reuben is planning to restore Joseph to Jacob, and Joseph is not killed. So instead, in verse 23, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. Now, on Sunday, we talked about the significance of this. Here, we're watching Joseph descend from the status of favored son to essentially nobody. In their case, they're intending to keep him a prisoner. We know ultimately he's going to become a slave first. So he's being stripped of his status as favored son. He's thrown into the pit. And they ultimately sell him to the Ishmaelites. So Reuben's plan to save Joseph kind of succeeds, but not in the way that he wants it to. Right? He's planning on going back later and bringing Joseph out and delivering him over to Israel. But while they're busy eating, they come up with this plan. And by the way, bear in mind, who is it that comes up with this plan to sell Joseph for some money? It's Judah who comes up with that plot. Reuben comes up with the idea not to kill him. And Judah comes up with the idea, well, hey, if we're not going to kill him, let's at least get something out of this. Maybe make a little money out of this. All right, that's important to bear in mind for what's going to happen later in the story, particularly with Judah. Judah's the one that comes up with this idea. So they haul him out, and they sell him to these traders as a slave. Reuben comes back and discovers that his plan has gone awry. And look at what they do. Verse 31. They took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe." A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. All right, do y'all see anything ironic about this situation? Who is it that's being fooled? It's Jacob who's being fooled. He's the deceiver, and in fact, you think about how is it that he came into his blessing? By deceiving somebody, and not just any sort of deceit. How did he deceive Isaac? With clothing. Moses ties a lot of these little details together. Jacob's sons are definitely his sons. Right? They are completely following after him, and kind of what goes around comes around in Jacob's case. It's been years since he pulled that trick on his dad, and now he's having it pulled on him. And look at how tricky they are about this. They say, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." Have they lied about it? I mean, you could say the finding the robe part is a lie, or perhaps it's a creative stretch. But notice what they allow to happen. Who comes up with the idea that Joseph has been eaten by a beast and torn to pieces? It's Jacob who gets this idea. Right? They just suggest the idea by sending the robe back dipped in blood. All right, now obviously their intent is to deceive, but you just look at how tricky they are about it, how slippery they are about it. They are, without a doubt, their father's sons. And Jacob goes into mourning for Joseph. Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth and ashes, mourned his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. Notice the gall of that. The sons that have just, they know that Joseph's not dead, and they see their father mourning for him, and they rise up to comfort him. It's okay, Dad. But he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." And here's another little touch of irony for us, because who do we expect to see that kind of behavior out of? That kind of dramatic, I'm going to die, things are so bad. We last saw that out of Rachel. Yeah. If you give me sons or I will die, she says. He says, I'm going to go down to Sheol for my son, mourning. And thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him, that is Joseph, in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Just out of curiosity, at this point, do your English translations give Potiphar any different titles? The English Standard says an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Do your translations say anything different? Captain of the bodyguards? Okay. So it's literally, and some people...
Even the King James Version says it.
Okay, it says bodyguards? Yeah, I think the King James generally refers to him as a chief of things, captain. We'll save talking about the titles until chapter 39. Because we'll see this come up again in chapter 39. Just what position Potiphar holds and what these names mean. Because this is another good example of our English translators kind of doing some interpreting for us, and generally pretty good interpreting with Potiphar. Not so much with the other two Egyptians that Joseph meets in chapter 39. But we'll get to that. Or not chapter 39, chapter 40. Okay. So, Joseph is taken down to Egypt and is sold. And so we're left without a doubt that pretty much everybody, all of the sons in this chapter are pretty rotten. Joseph's full of himself, relatively kind of clueless. The brothers are, they're ready to be murderers, by and large. they sell their brother into slavery to foreigners. Which, by the way, treating him in that way makes them very, very similar to Laban. Because remember, the accusation against Laban is that he has treated his own kin like foreigners. That's what Rachel and Leah say about him. That's what the brothers do. They treat their own brother like a foreigner, and they sell him into slavery. And then they lie to their father about it, and Jacob goes into extreme mourning for him. All right, any questions or comments about this part of the text before we continue into Genesis 38? All right, let's start in verse 1, chapter 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Hezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for Er his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim by the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I've not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay. So, seems like a really random change of direction at this point, because we expect the story to be about Joseph. Right? And in chapter 39, the story is going to come back to Joseph, and it's going to pick up right where Moses left off at the end of chapter 37. So the last thing we read is that the Midianites sell him in Egypt to Potiphar. The first thing we read in chapter 39, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. But in the meanwhile, in chapter 38, we get this unsavory story about what happens to Judah and to his sons. Now, it's obviously supposed to be connected to the other stories. Right? This isn't just some random aside. It's not a departure from the story. First off, we've got to remember this isn't just the story of Joseph. Right, Moses has told us in chapter 37 and verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. In other words, this is the story of Jacob's sons. Now, Joseph in this part of the story is the most preeminent among them, but it's not just going to be about Joseph. And there's also lots of connections that Moses makes between this story and the stories around it. Some of them are little verbal connections that bring the stories together. So, for example, at the end of chapter 37, Jacob said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." So Jacob says he's going to go down to Sheol. At the beginning of chapter 38, Moses tells us that Judah went down from his brothers. And at the beginning of chapter 39, he's going to tell us that the Ishmaelites had taken him down, had taken Joseph down to Egypt. All right, so all of these stories have the same action going on there. You have people going down. There's other little verbal connections, like at the end of chapter 37, Israel refuses to be comforted for the loss of Joseph. In the course of chapter 38, Judah loses his wife, and he is comforted after the loss of his wife, and that's what takes him to the sheep shearing. There's the connection between Joseph and Tamar in their use of clothing. Or at least there's the focus on clothing in chapter 37, chapter 38, and especially in chapter 39. Remember, and this is looking ahead, Mrs. Potiphar uses Joseph's clothing as evidence that he attempted to coerce her to lie down with him. Moses also draws some comparisons for us. Right, there's this, we're supposed to consider a comparison between the injustices that are committed in these chapters. Right, Joseph and Tamar, for example, are both falsely accused of sexual immorality. You know, Tamar in chapter 38 and Joseph in chapter 39. There's a contrast between Judah and Joseph. Right, in chapter 38, Judah is presented as not just unrighteous, but specifically, he's sexually lax. Right? The reason why Tamar's scheme is able to work is because we'll say Judah has poor impulse control. Whereas in chapter 39, Joseph has extraordinary self-control. Because as we'll see, Potiphar's wife is just throwing herself at him day after day, and Joseph resists her. That's despite his status as her slave, right? He's, in the ancient world, he has no rights. What she is doing to him is perfectly within her rights, and the Egyptians would have considered that to be normal. For a slave owner to do that to her slave. And yet Joseph resists. All right, so there's all these connections between the chapters. So it's about a different character, but it's carrying a lot of the same themes. Excuse me. So, what is this particular story about, and why is it included here? This is obviously a story about Judah, and it's going to set us up for understanding Judah later in the book. It's also a story about how you properly care for widows. And I think as we enter into this, and there's no chance we're going to finish this tonight, so we'll read this again on Sunday morning. But we should have in mind what the law of Moses says about this kind of situation. Keep your finger there in Genesis 38 and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25. And we're going to read a little bit out of the law. Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. All right, so this is, we sometimes refer to this as the law of levirate marriage. This is basically, how do you take care of a widow who doesn't have any sons? And we see this crop up every once in a while in the Scriptures. And it's a big, big deal because without sons, the widow becomes a true widow. In other words, what Paul would call a widow indeed. She has nobody to take care of her. And so the son is provided to later on help take care of the wife. But also, here in this law, what's the primary motivation for providing a son? What's the consequence of there not being a son? Mr. Judy? Carry on the name. To carry on the name of the deceased brother, right? So that his name would not be blotted out from Israel, would not be cut off from Israel. That's the goal of this. It protects the widow, but it also protects the dead man. It provides a posterity for the dead man. And that's what is supposed to happen here. If the brother-in-law refuses to do his duty in this case, do things turn out well for him as a result of this law? No, the widow comes up and spits in his face and takes his sandal off, and his name becomes, or at least the name of his house, becomes the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. It's like he gets a rude last name. The kind of name that if you were going through Ellis Island, would have to be changed. And that's what happens to him. And that is kind of the legal perspective that we ought to have in mind as we're considering the story of Judah and Tamar. Because, and that's, since we're nearly out of time, let's just jump straight to Onan. What is Onan's sin? Why does God strike Onan dead? Because he didn't want to perpetuate the name. It's not specifically because he's wasting his seed. Onan's name has come to mean something specific. Onanism refers to basically doing what Onan did, and not providing any sort of offspring from the person's seed. That specifically is not why he's stricken dead. The reason why he's stricken dead is because he refused to perpetuate the name of Er, his brother. Excuse me. And we're told in verse 10, what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord killed him. And the rest of the story, the rest of this conflict, what Tamar does to Judah, all centers around that interest in providing an heir for Er. It's a pun in English, it's not in Hebrew. I tell you, we'll finish up with this one last thing, and we'll come back to this story on Sunday. There is a pun in this story, and it's in the case of Er. His name, we're told that Er was very wicked or evil in the sight of the Lord. And the name Er is just, in Hebrew that can act like an E, and that's the Hebrew letter R. The word evil in Hebrew is just those same two letters swapped around. Er is evil spelled backwards. So that's the pun in this chapter. Erred. All right, so we'll come back to the story on Sunday. Any final questions or comments before we pack it in? Yes. Oh, yeah, well, and that's the thing. The story is very, very terse about it. In fact, the ESV kind of robs the life out of it. It says, let's see, the Lord put him to death. It's really wordy the way the ESV puts it. In Hebrew, it's only 2 words. The closest we can get in English is God killed him. And then the exact same thing of Onan. God saw what he did, that it was wicked, so God killed him too. Right? It's very, very terse, very short. And there is, I think, supposed to be a certain kind of humor in it. So, God killed him. All right. Thank you so much for your comments, your questions, and your kind attention this evening.